It was in 1245 that Stephen Langton devised this scheme of dividing the Bible up into chapters. His strategy was to develop chapters which were approximately all of the same length and each had one topic within it. An almost impossible task, you might think, but it produced the Bible in chapters as we have used it right down today. And so we can all be on the same page at the same time. And we're all on the same page, which is called John chapter 10. And bearing Stephen's idea in mind, perhaps like me, you're thinking, well, what was in chapter 9 and how did it morph into chapter 10? Well, chapter 9 is a fascinating chapter which is all about the day that Jesus restored sight to the man who was born blind. It's an account which is characterized by two confrontations. And the first confrontation is between the Jewish authorities and that man who was healed. And it's about who Jesus is and what they thought of him. And the Jewish authorities know that the man who has been healed has been healed by Jesus, and Jesus is their arch enemy. And so they tell the man bluntly, "We know this Jesus, he's a sinner." And the man who's healed, well, he comes back a bit feisty. He doesn't believe that for a moment. He said, "Really? That's really strange. Ever since the beginning of the world, nobody has ever given sight to a man who was born blind. No. Unless this man was from God, he couldn't possibly have done it." And that really upsets the Jewish authorities. But it does show us that this chapter is really about who do you think Jesus is. It's a common theme in many of the gospel chapters. So when we get to chapter 10, get it right, we find that it is about, firstly, Jesus, the Good Shepherd, and then if you read on, it's about Jesus claiming to be the Son of God. As the healed man said, he was sent by God. But the second confrontation is between Jesus and the man who is healed. The Jewish authorities, are so upset with this man that they dismiss him with the words, "You were born in sin and you're trying to teach us," and they throw him out of the synagogue. They excommunicate him. And Jesus hears of this and seeks the man out. And he says to the man, "Do you want to know the Son of Man?" And the healed man says, "Of course, but I don't know who he is. Who is he?" And Jesus replies, "You've met him once, and he's standing in front of you talking to you right now." And the healed man's response is to fall on his knees and to worship Jesus. And Jesus goes on to say that he's come into the world to give sight to the blind and at the same time to show other people that they are blind, even though they think they see. And the Jewish authorities that are standing nearby pick up on this remark and observe, are you talking about us? And Jesus obliquely says, "Well, if you were blind, then you wouldn't be guilty. But since you claim to see, then the guilt remains with you." In a way, he's saying yes. And so we see there is a subplot, if you like. It is the distinction between those who were blind and now can see, and those who think they can see, but actually have very poor vision indeed. And so it's interesting as we go into the next chapter that Jesus Well, the Bible often says it presents a parable, but it's not a parable because there's no story to it at all. It's a picture, and it's a picture of sheep keeping in Jewish villages. In a Jewish village, there are lots of houses, and every one of them would have a few sheep. By few, I mean 2, 3, 4, 5, not much more. They keep them for the wool, probably. But the sheep have to go out to feed every day. That requires a shepherd. And no Jewish house is going to have a shepherd for half a dozen sheep or so. So they run a syndicate in the village. One young son, will be nominated the shepherd. If you haven't got a young son, then 2 daughters will do. The shepherd, the young boy, gets up early in the morning. He starts at one end of the village. He comes to the first house. And the first house has a courtyard with a high wall around it and a gate across. And he knocks up the owner of the house, who comes and opens the gate. And the shepherd calls to the sheep hear his voice and come out. And so he goes to the next house, repeats the process. Slowly, he works his way down the village, stopping at every house, gathering sheep, building up a flock, until he gets to the far end of the village. And there's open country, and he takes the sheep out to find grazing. All day he looks after them, guides them, protects them. And then at the end of the day, he brings them back, and the process is reversed. The sheep are put back in the compound in each house, the gate is shut, and so the sheep are safe for the night. If a stranger would appear, the house owner would not open the gate. If it was a sheep stealer, the only way he's going to get into the compound is by climbing over the wall, which is probably about 6.5 feet high. Difficult. And if he gets in, the sheep will not recognize his voice and will flee from him. So that's the picture he presents in the beginning of chapter 10. And if you look carefully at the words, it's very repetitive. It says, the gate is open, the sheep hear the shepherd's voice, and they come out. The shepherd walks down the village, and they follow him because they know his voice. And then, to put it in the negative, they say, if a stranger appears, the sheep will not follow him because it doesn't know his voice. And so we can see that we moved from a chapter, which was all about who is blind and who can see, to a chapter really which is going to be about who is listening and who's becoming very hard of hearing. And I want to think about listening to the Good Shepherd. This story is set during Jesus' earthly ministry. Think about that. It's a process by which he travels from one village to the next with his 12 disciples. They rock up at a village, and Jesus speaks to any crowd that gathers. He preaches to them. He teaches them. And principally, he talks about the kingdom of God. God's rule is coming, he says. Perhaps he persuades somebody to join that kingdom. Afterwards, he probably is involved in healing people who are sick, driving out demons, and if he comes across a funeral, he tends to wreck it. Well, all of this you can see, this stuff about death and demons and diseases, is all stuff which does not belong in the kingdom of God. So everything he is doing in such a day is about building the kingdom and pushing out of the kingdom things that don't belong there. At the end of the day, perhaps they have a meal, sit round a fire, and at the end of the evening, they get their one blanket, wrap it round them, and sleep out in the open under the stars. And so they go on day after day for several months. It's one continued camping expedition. How would you be after a month or two of that? Actually, there are a few women who travel with them. I suspect they may well prepare the evening meal, and if their guys are lucky, they do some washing. I really hope they do. Anyway, it's pretty exhausting going through that, I would imagine. Tiring, grubby. Yeah, pretty unpleasant after a few months, I would think. They need R&R. Pretty desperately, I should think. Yes. And then, having done that for a few months, Jesus says, right, guys, we're going to Jerusalem. They're going to rock up at one of the festivals. Passover, Pentecost, Feast of Booths or Shelters, you name it. There's lots of them. And they're all supposed to be there. And so that's, well, from Galilee to Jerusalem, that's about 90 miles walk, because you can't go through Samaria if you're a proper Jew. And then when you got to Jericho, well, it's about 12 miles, I think, in those days, up to Jerusalem. And up's the relative word. Jericho is below sea level. It's about a 3,000 foot plus climb to Jerusalem. So these exhausted people do this long walk. When they get to Jerusalem, there's usually bother between the religious authorities and Jesus. They try to arrest him, they try to stone him, upset of one sort or another. And only after the festival, Jesus says, okay, guys, we're going to go to Bethany. That's another 5 miles. And there they're going to reach the house of Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. And there they're going to get rest and food and comfort, and they're going to crash out. So let's think about that house. I don't know about you, but I've always imagined that Martha was the oldest, the one who was the organizer, the one for whom nothing was impossible, she would attempt to do it. And that her sister Mary was the quiet one, very pensive, thoughtful. And Lazarus, well, I suspect, though I have no grounds for saying it, that he was once the baby of the family, but now has grown up to be a young man. And they live together in this house, 5 miles outside of Jerusalem, and they have a quiet life, a pleasant, comfortable life. But suddenly, these 13 guys are going to appear, and they're going to have to host them for some unknown period. What a sort of impact on your household would be 12 scruffy guys, hungry, tired, turning up at your door, have on your life, I wonder. Anyway, that's what happens. And sure enough, they turn up, and everything's wonderful. At least to begin with, it is. But then there seems to be some tension in the air. And a short way into the stay, Martha has a little wobble. Well, no, it's a big wobble. It's a rant, really. It's not fair, she suddenly bursts out, directing her voice at Jesus. It's just not fair. I've scrubbed these floors until my fingers hurt, and I've tidied it from top to bottom. It's not fair. And just look at my sister. What's she doing? Helping? No, she's just sitting there talking to Jesus. It's not good enough. It's just not good enough. I've plucked the chicken, I've baked all the bread, I've slaved all over the oven all day. And look at my sister, she's doing nothing, just sitting there talking to Jesus. It won't do. It just won't do. She goes on. I've washed up, I've tidied up, I've dried up, and now I'm fed up. And look at my sister. All she does is sit there and listen to Jesus. Poor Martha. Ah, poor girl. It's all got on top of her, all the things that she needs to do. She's stressed out, choked up. She's going down for the third time. And Mary, she's just sitting there. She's cut out everything that's a distraction, and she's doing what she decided. She's going to sit and listen to Jesus. Clever girl, eh? She's going to be where Jesus is speaking. And so our problem is, where should we go to hear God speak to us? Several answers. Church would be a good one. There are churches you can go to where you probably won't hear much about God speaking, and there are others where you have a good chance of hearing him speak to you. I would suggest that this one might be a good choice. No, I don't suggest, I recommend. Alternatively, you may think that the Bible is a good place to go and hear God speak to you. And I would agree. But I rather think it depends on the way you approach that. Turning to the Bible may inform you, but it may alternatively transform you. If you go to the Bible in the mode of Bible study, sort of sitting over it, criticizing it, analyzing it, rather like I did it at the beginning of this talk when I talked about dividing into chapters and the basis on which it was done. Yes. If that's your approach, then I think you will become informed. You will learn and acquire a lot of Bible knowledge. If alternatively you rather copy Mary, and your approach is to engage with the Bible, to find a quiet place, to sit down, to read it aloud, slowly, to meditate on it, to think about what it might be saying to you, then I think you could well hear God speak to you, and as a consequence, be transformed. I leave you with that thought.